In the narrow throat, where the Red Sea pours into the Gulf of Aden, the wind can turn without warning. It presses salt into skin, stings eyes, and makes the horizon shimmer like a blade. In that waterway, later Arabic would call the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, a name that sounds like poetry until one remembers how easily ships can vanish there, how quickly trade becomes tribute, and how often ambition reaches for the other shore. Long before cannon and steam, before empires drew straight lines across maps, rulers on both sides of this strait understood one truth: whoever commanded the passage could tax the world. Across the water rose the highland plateaus of the Northern Horn, a land of stone terraces, seasonal rivers, and caravan roads that climbed toward cool elevations. On the opposite coast lay South Arabia, where deserts broke into fertile highlands and where irrigation and dam building could turn valleys into grain and vineyards. Between them ran the Red Sea, not a barrier but a corridor, and along that corridor flowed incense, ivory, gold, enslaved labor, salt, glass, cloth, and the most dangerous cargo of all: legitimacy. A king who could boast control of sea lanes could bargain with distant powers and silence rivals at home. The Ethiopian Sabaean Wars and the wider cycle of conflict between the Northern Horn and the kingdoms of South Arabia were never one clean campaign. They were a centuries-long contest for influence, fought through raids, garrisons, alliances with tribes, control of ports, and sudden amphibious strikes. It was a struggle over harbors and caravans, but also over gods and titles, inscriptions and memory. The earliest written traces of this contest do not come from later chronicles, but from stone. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, at a place called Yeha, massive dressed blocks still stand in walls that have outlasted dynasties. The great temple there, dating to about the 7th century BCE, was dedicated to the god Al-Makar and built with a precision that needed neither mortar nor apology. Near that temple and across the surrounding highlands, inscriptions were carved in a South Arabian script and in a Sabaeic language that did not remain frozen. Scholars note that these texts, associated with the polity called Dimt, show close cultural connection to South Arabia while also revealing local elements, including deviations in vocabulary and the recording of maternal lineage in royal titles. More than 200 such inscriptions are known, and they remain a core written window into the early 1st millennium BCE highlands. It would be easy, in a world trained by Eurocentric myths, to treat this as a simple story of influence flowing in one direction, from Arabia to Africa. That shortcut collapses under the weight of the evidence. The same inscriptions that show contact also show adaptation. The same stone temples that echo foreign forms also sit inside a landscape of African political formation. The Red Sea was not a one-way pipeline, it was a contested highway. In that contest, the strait itself shaped strategy. The Bab el-Mandeb was narrow enough for fleets to cross quickly, yet unpredictable enough to punish careless planning. Whoever held ports on either side could choke trade, but whoever tried to dominate both shores risked stretching supply lines across hostile water. Red Sea power demanded more than warriors. It demanded shipbuilding, provisioning, pilots who knew currents, and administrators who could turn captured towns into revenue. The stakes were amplified by what moved through the corridor. South Arabia's wealth was tied to caravan routes and water systems, and its rulers gained authority by presenting themselves as guardians of dams, fields, and temples. The Northern Horn connected inland resources to coastal exchange. Ivory and gold could be extracted from wider hinterlands, then funneled to ports that faced Arabia. Each side watched the other not only as a rival, but as a mirror, proof that greatness could be built without Rome's permission. By the early centuries of the Common Era, a new name began to dominate the African shore: Axum. Later, writers would praise Axum for coins and monuments, and modern reference works describe Axumite interaction with South Arabian kingdoms as sometimes amicable and sometimes hostile, including invasions and occupations. Once Axum began to look outward, South Arabia became more than a market. It became terrain. Sabaeic inscriptions would record Ethiopians arriving as allies in local wars, settling with their families, and fighting in units organized along clan lines. In other moments, those inscriptions speak of Ethiopian forces burning, advancing, or being defeated. What emerges is not a tale of occasional piracy. It is the record of a state learning how to project power across a sea. The Ethiopian Sabaean wars were therefore never only about loot. They were about who would dictate the terms of Red Sea life. They were about who would claim the right to protect communities, punish rivals, and define sacred legitimacy across two continents. The struggle would move from temple precincts to fortified coasts, from royal titles to mass violence, and from alliance diplomacy to decisive invasion. What follows is that long, hard arc, told from the viewpoint that the Red Sea's history was not done to Africa, but made with African hands. Long before Axum's fleets and Himyar's fortresses, the highlands produced authority that scholarship groups under names like Dement centered around places such as Yeha. The surviving evidence is thin, but the point is firm. Early states in the Northern Horn were not waiting to be invented. They managed irrigation, forged tools and weapons, and spoke in the language of kingship. Debates continue over how much was borrowed and how much was homegrown, but the presence of an indigenous political landscape is not in doubt, and that landscape is the soil from which later Axumite power rose. Axum's first problem was not how to conquer the far shore, but how to become unignorable on its own. In the Horn, rainfall could be generous one season and cruel the next. A ruler needed granaries, not just glory. He needed to turn farmers into taxpayers without shattering the social fabric that kept terraces maintained and herds moving. Only when that balance was held could soldiers be kept in the field long enough to matter. Trade multiplied what the land could not easily provide. Axum's power grew beside the Red Sea, linked to ports and routes that carried African exports north and east. In later summaries of Axum's history, the kingdom is described as expanding across the Red Sea into southern Arabia for a time, taking advantage of its location and profiting from long-distance exchange. On the Arabian side, Saba and later Himyar understood the same arithmetic. Whoever could direct caravans and protect irrigation works could claim the right to rule. Yet the Red Sea was making older overland routes less secure, and maritime traffic could bypass traditional toll points. That shift threatened established elites and created openings for outsiders with ships. The 3rd century became an age of experiments in power projection. South Arabian inscriptions, as summarized in the Ancient Arabia reference work, document a phase in which Ethiopian-South Arabian relations are unusually visible in the record, with numerous texts mentioning Ethiopian forces, envoys, and alliances. It notes that Axumites were sometimes referred to directly as Axumites, but more often by terms connected to the root that gave later languages Abyssinia. It also emphasizes that leadership of Ethiopian troops in South Arabia was often delegated to a royal son, a sign that overseas command was considered too important to leave to mere captains. At first, Axum did not arrive as a solitary invader. It arrived as a partner in South Arabia's own disputes. During the reign of the Sabaean king Al-Nafan, the reference work states that he formed an alliance with the Axumite king Gadarat, and that the alliance was deemed significant enough to be celebrated repeatedly in inscriptions. One condition was mutual aid in war, and when conflict erupted between Saba and Himyar, Axum joined the pro-Sabaean coalition. This moment matters because it shows the Ethiopian agency operating through diplomacy rather than conquest. Axum was reading the political map and inserting itself where local rivals would welcome foreign muscle. It was a familiar strategy in later centuries of world history, but here it appears in the ancient Red Sea, an African kingdom using alliance networks to shape events abroad. Alliance, however, is never eternal. In South Arabia, political unions could be revived and broken as quickly as rainstorms. The same reference work describes how the Himyarite king re-established, at least temporarily, a Sabaean-Himyarite union with himself at its head, a development the Axumites did not accept. Ethiopian forces invaded and advanced to Zafar, only to be defeated by a Sabaean force. The lesson was brutal. Crossing the sea was possible. Holding the highland interior of Yemen against determined enemies was another matter. Defeat did not end involvement, it hardened it. After that point, Axumite relations with Saba remained hostile for the rest of Saba's history, and Ethiopians established settlements in Yemen's Tihama, the coastal plain. The sources even mention wives and children associated with these settlements, suggesting communities that intended to stay, not simply raid and leave. Diplomatic contact was made at the town of Al-Sar, which appears to have functioned as an administrative headquarters for Axumite activity in South Arabia. In other words, the war over the Red Sea kingdoms became a war of presence. Garrisoning and settlement changed the stakes. Now the contest was not only between kings, but between populations, and every local dispute could become a spark near stored powder. Ethiopian troops were organized in units whose name reflects clan-based divisions, and this hints at how Axum exported not only soldiers, but social structure. On the African shore, this overseas venture also reshaped Axum itself. To maintain fighters across the water required ships, supplies, and administrators, and those costs would have to be extracted from farmers and towns. The old question returned, in sharper form: how much strain could a state impose before its own base cracked? Power abroad could buy prestige at home, but it could also drain the treasury and sharpen rivalries among elites who resented the burden. The Ethiopian Sabaean Wars, at this stage, were not yet defined by religious banners or by single heroic leaders. They were defined by logistics, by the shifting loyalties of tribes, and by the thin red line of the coast. The strait offered opportunity, but it also offered the enemy the same short crossing. Every shipment of grain, every replacement of spears, every change of wind could decide whether an African garrison endured or drowned in isolation. Soon, the conflict would reach a peak in the mid-3rd century, when Axumite occupation briefly touched the critical nodes of caravan life, and when South Arabian kings responded with campaigns meant to burn out the foreign presence like a fever. That escalation would mark the transformation of a maritime rivalry into an ancient struggle for regional supremacy. By the 3rd century, Axum's rulers could no longer be treated as regional chiefs. Later summaries of the kingdom describe it as one of the great powers of its age, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. And they emphasize coinage and long-distance trade as tools that turned local authority into international leverage. Coins functioned as propaganda as much as money, carrying royal images and symbols into markets far from the highlands. That circulation mattered because it broadcast a message. Axum's sovereignty had weight, literally, in gold and silver, and that weight could be spent to hire allies or intimidate rivals across the sea. In the ports, customs officers and scribes made lists, and those lists became power, because what is counted can be commanded too, abroad. In the mid-3rd century, the contest sharpened into something closer to open war for the heart of the southern Arabian system. The ancient Arabia reference work describes this period as a high point for Axumite occupation, noting that the Axumites briefly occupied Najran, the departure point for northward caravan trade, and that the oasis was administered by a governor of the Axumite king. That single detail reveals the ambition behind the crossings. Najran was not just a town, it was a switch controlling the flow of wealth toward the wider world. To hold such a node required more than swords. It required agreements with local tribes, the management of water, the policing of roads, and the ability to punish raiders who could vanish into hills. The same source notes that Axumites maintained close contact with local groups and often acted in concert with them. In an environment where kings ruled through networks rather than through a single, unbroken chain of command, coalition was the true weapon. Yet, the coalition cuts both ways. South Arabia's rulers were not passive victims waiting for foreign fleets. They were experienced in war, fortified by mountains, and skilled in the politics of surrender and revenge. The reference work notes that the alliance between Himyar and Axum did not last, and that at a later point both Himyar and the Axumites surrendered to the Sabaean co-regents. It also describes a subsequent Himyarite campaign that brought an end, at least temporarily, to Axumite occupation in South Arabia. In other words, the foreign presence could be broken. From the African perspective, this was not simply a defeat, it was an education. It taught Axum's elites that the Red Sea did not reward half measures. If the kingdom wanted influence in Arabia, it would need either permanent dominance at sea or permanent partners on land. Otherwise, each expedition would become a costly flare, bright for a moment, then extinguished. In the early 4th century, diplomacy returned as a tool. The reference work records a diplomatic exchange between Himyar and Axum during the reign of a Himyarite king, but it also suggests that relations turned sour afterward. It mentions repairs at Zafar after Ethiopians burned a residential structure, implying an Ethiopian attack on the Himyarite capital that ultimately failed. Even failure, however, could be turned into political fiction. Axumite rulers later claimed Saba and Himyar in their titles, as if the act of striking the capital were enough to justify the language of conquest. This is where the struggle begins to touch something deeper than taxation. Titles matter because they shape how subjects imagine their ruler. A king who could claim lands across the sea looked larger than local rivals. He looked chosen. He looked like the guardian of a wider world. Such claims could stabilize rule at home, even if the overseas reality was unstable. Then, in the 4th century, another force entered the Red Sea contest: Christianity. The ancient Arabia reference work describes the introduction of Christianity as a development of long-term importance on both sides of the Bab el-Mandeb. It notes that Izana embraced the new religion, establishing it as the state religion of Axum, while Himyar's elite did not convert, though Christianity spread in South Arabia, especially in Najran. The open-stack style overview of Axum and Himyar similarly emphasizes the 6th century apex of Axumite influence coinciding with its extension into southern Arabia, and it frames later conflict with Himyar in explicitly religious terms, including a campaign against the Himyarite king Du-Nuwas and a Byzantine alliance. Religion did not erase politics, it sharpened it. A Christian Axum could present itself as a protector of Christian communities across the sea, turning intervention into duty rather than opportunism. A non-Christian or Jewish-leaning Himyarite elite could interpret that claim as a foreign threat wrapped in sacred language. The strait became not only an economic choke point, but a frontier of identity. Still, the 5th century in the inscriptional record is sparse, and silence can hide storms. When evidence returns in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, it speaks of persecution, diplomacy, and the return of Ethiopian troops to South Arabia with a renewed sense of mission. The ancient Arabia reference work notes persecution of Christians by Himyar's Jewish elite beginning in the late 5th century, and it describes Axum establishing a diplomatic presence at Zafar in 509 before becoming involved in the conflict. By then, centuries of earlier crossings had created a memory of possibility. The sea route had been tested, alliances had been made and betrayed, settlements had appeared on the coastal plain. The names of places like Najran and Zafar carried weight in Axumite imagination. The coming war would not be an improvisation. It would be the return of an old contest, now energized by faith and by the shadow of two great empires beyond the region, Byzantium and Persia. The slow-burn tension of the Ethiopian Sabaean struggle was reaching its religious turning point. The next phase would be triggered not by abstract strategy, but by blood, by fire, and by the deliberate decision of rulers to make a community's survival depend on conversion or death. This shift in power was also a shift in language and record-keeping. Axum inherited South Arabian script traditions and adapted them into forms that developed into the Ge'ez writing system used in inscriptions and later religious life. The Kingdom of Axum overview notes that early South Arabian involvement left a legacy, including adoption of ancient South Arabian script, which developed into the Ge'ez script. Writing was not decoration. It was authority carved into stone, a way to fix victories, titles, and sacred claims beyond the reach of rumor. Ezana's reign left a rare kind of evidence, victory inscriptions that spoke to multiple audiences. The OpenStax overview notes a monumental stela inscribed in Ge'ez, Sabaean, and Greek, a deliberate announcement that Axum was multilingual, maritime, and outward-facing. In stone, the kingdom presented itself as global. Claims traveled with every ship. When violence is used to force belief, it is never only about belief. It is a declaration of who has the right to exist and who must kneel to remain alive. In South Arabia, the late 5th and early 6th centuries saw exactly that kind of politics, and the Red Sea kingdoms understood that the outcome would echo across the water. The Ancient Arabia reference work states that persecution of Christians by Himyar's Jewish elite began in the late 5th century, and that by the early 6th century, Axum, which had established a diplomatic presence at Zafar in 509, became involved. It describes an initial Axumite campaign in 518 that brought to power a Himyarite Christian proxy ruler backed by an Axumite garrison. This was not merely a humanitarian gesture, it was a strategic play. A friendly ruler in Himyar meant security for Christian communities, but it also meant influence over ports and routes on the Arabian side. It meant a buffer against rivals who might invite Persian help. It meant leverage in the long competition for Red Sea dominance. Yet proxy rule is fragile, especially when it rests on foreign bayonets. Within a few years, the proxy king was overthrown by a Jewish Himyarite rebel, Yusuf Asa Yatha, better known in later memory as Du-Nuwas. The Ancient Arabia reference work describes how he massacred the Axumite garrison at Zafar, burned the local church, and fortified the Red Sea coast against Axum. The text also recounts his autumn 523 attack on Najran, offering Christians a choice of conversion to Judaism or death. It notes that while inscriptions do not directly record this Najran campaign, it is detailed in Greek and Syriac hagiographies. Najran mattered beyond its walls. It was a caravan hub, a meeting place of merchants and faiths, a node in the wider economy of Arabia. To massacre its Christians was to send a message to every coastal town and every inland tribe. The old balance of tolerance was over. The aim was to remake the political landscape by remaking identity. The OpenStax style overview of Axum and Himyar frames the 6th century conflict as the culmination of a long religious competition, describing Christianity in Axum and Judaism in Himyar as informing governments and cultures, and it highlights the way faith shaped identities in late antiquity. It also notes that Byzantine interests aligned with Axum in campaigns against Himyar. To understand why Byzantium mattered, one must remember that great empires rarely fight only where their borders touch. they fight through partners. The Red Sea was an artery connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and control of its gateways could threaten or protect the flow of wealth. A Christian Axum in Yemen could complicate Persian ambitions and offer Byzantium a southern lever. A Himyar, hostile to Christianity, could seek Persian support and turn the region into an anti-Byzantine corridor. In this atmosphere, Dunuwas's actions became more than local persecution. They became a regional provocation. The Axumite king Caleb, ruling a Christian kingdom across the sea, now faced a choice that was both moral and political. If he did nothing, he would appear weak before his own elites and unfaithful to co-religionists abroad. If he intervened, he would gamble resources and live in a theatre where earlier Axumite ventures had been reversed. Wikipedia's summary of the Axumite invasion of Himyar describes the conflict as a series of invasions between 518 and 525, fought between the Christian kingdom of Axum and the Jewish Himyarite kingdom, and it frames them as proxy wars waged with Byzantine support during broader Roman-Persian rivalry. It describes the 518 expedition, the coup of Dunuwas, and the massacre at Najran as triggers for the later invasion led by Caleb. Whatever one thinks of later narrative layers, the core reality remains. An African king was preparing to project power decisively across the Red Sea. The coastline was fortified, the crossing was dangerous, but the political wind was shifting. The Bab el-Mandeb had become a moral frontier, and Caleb's answer would determine whether Axum would be remembered as a regional guardian or as a kingdom that let the sea swallow its obligations. The slow burn of earlier centuries was about taxes and titles. Now it was also about martyrs and survival. The next phase would bring ships, spears, and a landing that aimed not merely to punish, but to reorder the Red Sea world. Najran's slaughter carried another message that could be read even by those who did not share the theology. It warned that commerce could be weaponized. Merchants, who depended on safe passage, learned that protection might now require declaring loyalty to a ruler's faith. Tribes that had balanced between rival kingdoms were forced to pick sides because neutrality could be interpreted as sympathy. The ancient Arabia account emphasizes that Yusuf's revolt included the destruction of churches and the fortification of the Red Sea coast against Axum, a signal that he expected retaliation and intended to turn the shoreline into a killing ground for any landing. The geography made that threat credible. The Bab el-Mandeb narrows the world, compressing sea lanes and making every coastal inlet feel strategically meaningful. It is a strait between Yemen and the Horn of Africa that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, a reminder that imperial politics can hinge on a passage only a few dozen kilometers wide. When such a choke point is contested, religious persecution becomes inseparable from statecraft, because each side assumes the other is fighting not only for souls, but for control of the gate itself. For Caleb, the decision carried domestic risk. A king who asked nobles to fund ships and farmers to supply grain had to promise results, because failure invited revolt at home and ridicule abroad. The sources emphasize fortified coasts and mass killing. They also imply the price of hesitation. In such moments, mercy and strategy can point together, yet still demand an army, unyielding. The invasion that followed was not a raid. It was a statement that the Red Sea could be crossed by organized state power and that the African shore could decide the fate of a kingdom in Arabia. In later retellings, the image is stark. Ships gathered, a coastline watched, chains and barriers prepared, and a ruler willing to place his legitimacy on the outcome. Wikipedia's overview of the Axumite invasion of Himyar describes a major campaign in 525 inches, response to the massacres of Christians, noting that the Byzantine Emperor Justin I called for action and that Caleb decided to lead his armies in person. It also describes Roman reinforcements and the defeat of Yusuf du Nuwas, after which a Christian ruler, Sumyafa Ashwa, was installed and churches were rebuilt. The Ancient Arabia reference work offers a more detailed sequence. It states that after Yusuf attacked Najran in 523, Caleb invaded again in the spring of 529, leading the Axumite army personally. It notes that Yusuf was killed during the landing and that the Axumite army quickly took control of key sites, including Zafar, Sana'a, Marib, Wadi al-Jawf, and Najran. It describes Caleb spending 7 months in South Arabia, restoring churches and welcoming back Christians who had been forcibly converted. It then describes the installation of Sumyafa Ashwa as proxy ruler, with inscriptions implying a greater degree of Axumite control than earlier arrangements. Regardless of which precise dating a narrator adopts, the meaning of the episode does not change. Axumite power arrived by sea, shattered a hostile regime, and tried to build a new order on the Arabian shore. In practical terms, that meant garrisons, governors, and an administrative vocabulary that could translate conquest into routine. It also meant managing local elites who would accept the new order only as long as it served their interests. This is where the story turns, because victory creates its own enemies. A foreign-installed ruler is always accused of being a puppet. A foreign garrison is always viewed as an occupation, even by those who benefit from its protection. And a king who claims to be a liberator can become, in the eyes of others, a new overlord. The Ancient Arabia reference work states that Sumyafa Ashwa, like the earlier Proxy ruler, was overthrown not by a Himyarite rebellion, but by an Ethiopian Christian officer named Abraha, who seized power sometime after 531 and reigned for decades. It notes that punitive campaigns sent by Caleb failed to remove him and that Abraha was left in place, apparently agreeing to pay tribute. It also describes Abraha's effective autonomy, his restoration of the Marib Dam as a gesture to South Arabian subjects, and his military campaigns that extended Himyar's reach, while he continued to invoke Christian formulas in his inscriptions. There is a hard lesson here about empire, even in antiquity. The first conqueror rarely enjoys the full harvest of conquest. Control slips to commanders on the ground, to ambitious generals who learn the terrain, cultivate local allies, and command loyalty that the distant king cannot easily replace. Abraha's coup shows that Axum's projection of power created a new political actor who could use Ethiopian military presence to build his own legitimacy. For Axum, this was both triumph and danger. The kingdom had demonstrated that it could dominate the strait and overturn a regime. But it had also proven that keeping a hand on South Arabia required constant expenditure and constant vigilance. Tribute could soften the blow, yet tribute could also disguise the reality that control had fractured. The OpenStack style overview notes that Axum controlled southern Arabia until the Sassanian conquest in 572, and it suggests that Caleb's campaign may have overextended Axum's resources, contributing to later decline. It also points to disruptions of trade networks as Persian and later forces moved around the Red Sea. Still, in the immediate aftermath, the narrative on the African shore could be framed as righteous intervention. Churches were restored, a persecutor was defeated. The Red Sea momentarily looked like a Christian lake patrolled by Axumite ships, yet beneath that moral clarity lay the more unstable truth. South Arabia was not a trophy that could be carried home. It was a living arena where power had to be negotiated every season and where a single ambitious commander could turn liberation into his own dynasty. The final chapter of this struggle would come when Persia intervened directly, when Axum's grip loosened, and when the Red Sea entered a new age. But even then, the memory of Caleb's crossing would remain a monument of African reach, a reminder that the Gate of Tears had once opened for an army that sailed from the Horn. Amphibious war in this period was an ordeal of timing. Axumite ships had to gather beyond the sight of coast watchers, then cross fast enough to land before defenses could concentrate. Later summaries, including Wikipedia's account, speak of fleets and large troop numbers, and even if such figures are debated, the underlying reality is clear. The campaign required organization on a scale that only a mature state could attempt. A coastal landing also meant that failure was catastrophic because defeat could strand thousands between sea and mountain. Caleb's willingness to lead in person turned the landing into a test of royal honor as much as strategy. After the victory, Axum faced the task, making a conquest routine. A garrison must be paid even when no enemy appears, and local elites must be rewarded without becoming too strong. The ancient Arabia account shows how easily proxy kings fell and how commanders could seize initiative, as Abraha did. Every season of occupation became negotiation between African authority and Arabian realities, with the sea as both lifeline and trap. Even rebuilding churches and reopening markets required guards, builders, and supplies. Without that, liberation would look like chaos, and chaos would invite the next usurper. So the victors had to govern, or the sea would return them empty, exhausted. The end of an overseas empire is rarely announced by a trumpet. More often, it arrives as a slow leak. Fewer ships, unpaid soldiers, coastal towns that stop answering, governors who negotiate their own deals, and merchants who reroute their cargo to safer ports. The Red Sea, which had once amplified Axum's power, began to transmit other forces. The OpenStax-style overview of Axum and Himyar describes how Axum's decline may have been accelerated by economic difficulty, climate shifts, and the possibility that Caleb's Arabian campaigns overextended finances and military strength. It also notes that Sassanian occupation around the Red Sea might have disrupted Axum's trade network, and that revolts occurred in some Axumite cities. On the Arabian side, the ancient Arabia reference work describes the fall of Abraha's dynasty and the arrival of a Sassanian invasion of Himyar around 570, an invasion that toppled the Ethiopian-linked order in South Arabia. This shift reveals how the Red Sea kingdoms were never isolated from larger global power dynamics. Axum and the South Arabian states were not merely local actors. They were participants in a wider competition between Byzantium and Persia, and later they would face the rapid expansion of Islam. But it is important to state the central point with moral clarity. Participation is not the same as dependency. Axum did not exist as a pawn. It acted as a player, forcing the great powers to account for it. That is why the Ethiopian Sabaean wars matter to modern audiences. Too often, mainstream history treats Africa as background scenery until outsiders arrive with paper and steel. The Red Sea record breaks that narrative. It shows African rulers deploying diplomacy, building fleets, establishing garrisons, and shaping the religious and political fate of territories across the sea. It shows African power not as an exception, but as a normal feature of an interconnected ancient world. The earlier period of Yeha and Dimt offers an even deeper correction. UNESCO's description of Yeha highlights the Great Temple's 7th century BCE date and its significance as evidence for complex culture in the Northern Horn, connected to exchanges with South Arabia, but embedded in local identity and pride. Likewise, the Ethio-Sabaean Inscriptions Project describes those highland texts as the only written source of information about DMMT, documenting close cultural connection to South Arabia while also showing deviations and local traditions such as maternal lineage in rulers' titles. Seen together, these sources challenge two lazy extremes. One extreme imagines the Horn as merely an echo of Arabia. The other imagines the Horn as sealed off from the wider world until medieval times. The real picture is more powerful than either myth. The Northern Horn was in conversation with neighbors early, and it built states capable of both absorbing influence and projecting force. The wars across the Bab el-Mandeb also carry a psychological lesson. They reveal how pride and danger travel together. To claim guardianship of a strait is to invite enemies who fear being choked. To intervene as a protector of a persecuted community is to create expectations that cannot be abandoned without shame. Caleb's campaigns could be framed as righteous defense, but they also bound Axum to an overseas theater where control was never complete and where generals like Abraha could seize initiative. And yet, even in eventual retreat, the achievement stands. An Axumite fleet crossing into Yemen was not a fantasy. It was a real exercise of African sovereignty over maritime space. For a time, the Red Sea's southern gate was shaped by decisions made in the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea. That fact, by itself, is a rebuke to any narrative that reserves empire, strategy, or statecraft for Europe alone. In the end, the Gate of Tears did what it has always done. It allowed the world to pass, and it punished those who tried to freeze it into a single order. But the Ethiopian-Sabaean wars left their imprint in stone and memory. Temples at Yeha stand like proof of early power. Inscriptions preserve names and claims. And the story of Axum's crossings remains an epic reminder that in the ancient battle over the Red Sea kingdoms, Africa was not conquered history. Africa was history, steering ships into the wind and demanding that the other shore answer. In the 7th century, new forces tightened the circle. The Kingdom of Axum overview describes how Persian and later Muslim presence in the Red Sea contributed to economic strain, shrinking coastal control and isolating Axum from earlier Mediterranean trade. It notes that trade with the Roman and Byzantine world halted as Arab forces seized provinces, and that Axum eventually ceased minting coins. Even then, the kingdom's earlier reputation endured, visible in accounts of early Muslim refugees finding asylum across the sea, a moment that unintentionally confirms Axum's remaining authority. A weak state cannot offer sanctuary that others respect.